Hello, 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 and welcome back to another exciting episode of Live from the House of Sound. I can't remember what I've decided to call this place. The Northwoods House of Sound and Fun, something like that. Anyway, it's good to be here. It's been an exciting month since I was here last. If you call exciting being holed up in the woods for a month. The weather's been unpredictable, from ice storms to wet snow yesterday, which is all melting today. Gone from highs of 60 degrees Fahrenheit to lows of -1 or 2 Fahrenheit. Sometimes in the course of a couple of days. So it's that time of year when anything can happen. And in other news, the video I just shared was one that I've just put together today, a rough cut of a video for a song that I'm releasing right now and coming from an album that will be out shortly. And I thought we'd just do a little walkthrough of that tune to get us started, to show you a different way of using reason. Let's kill that and see if I've got my audio and get it at a level that we can tolerate. There we go. Okay. As you can hear, there's lots of reverb on everything. Yeah. This is the intro music, by the way, to Andy. This is all done in Reason, but using no Reason instruments, all live instruments. So gives you a chance to see another approach and how Reason does just a fine job. Let's see what we got. Oh, let's look at this view. Will give you a better idea. Orange is drum tracks, yellow is percussion, with a couple of more percussion below. I don't know, I didn't stick to my concept very well, I guess. Then I have a percussion guitar track, gong, and a couple of synth pads, and I'll go through them all. And then the flutes, 2 different flutes on this. I don't know if anybody was here last month and saw the previous song. There was a lot more editing required on that song. This song has large chunks that just play as it was recorded. One of the things I'll do often is, you can see in the percussion section we have loops that are, 8, 10, 20, 30 bars long, different lengths to get the effect. The drum track was played all the way through. Let's just start going through that. Bass drum. The bass drum had an inside mic, which is this one, and an outside mic, which is that one. Just let me turn it up a little. That's very dark. And a little bit chopped. I think we're doing a little gating on this one. I don't normally, yes, doing some gating. I don't normally do heavy gates, but the more you've got live instruments, the more that they certainly come in handy. This is a Beta 58, not 52 rather, the bullet looking microphone on the outside of the kick, and a 421 on the inside. This one has the high end rolled off as it was tracked, because all it's doing is the bottom end. Then for the snare drum, oh, looks like, see, I haven't visited this track for a couple months now. Looks like I got a little bit of reverb on the snare with a pre-delay in time, like an 8th note in time with the music. That's a common thing I'll do from way back. As soon as I got my first PCM 70 in the 80s, it was on everything I did was a little pre-delay. There's a ratty mic on the bottom. It's a little clip-on mic on the bottom of the snare. Does a great job. You won't hear the toms. There's one of the toms. Here comes a tom fill. Let's go ahead and skip. And sounds like there's a bit of reverb on the toms too. My approach with drums is typically to mic the kit from the overheads pretty full, but it looks like on this one I've rolled off. You see it here? Yeah, I've got Looks like I've rolled off some low end. Don't always do that on the overheads. It depends on how it's blending with the rest of the kit, but I try to get as much of the whole kit captured in the overheads as possible. Room mics go on and off. They're off right here, of course. It happens when you solo something, it usually stops playing. This is the room I'm in right now, which is a 20 by 30 with a peak of 18 feet in the middle ceilings, but 9 feet at one end and 5 feet at the other, so the ceilings slope way down. So we've got 18-foot ceilings at one point in the room. The rest, I figured the average is 14 feet. Then I've got this little mono Chinese ribbon mic that I love that's out in front of the kit, about knee high or so, about 4 or 5 feet out, straight in front of the kick. And the room mics are about 20 feet away, by the way. If you hear them in context, you'll hear there is a bit of a little delay. I don't know how easy that is to tell. Oh, you also hear the bass coming from the kick drum. And let's visit that real quick. That's using Infuser. Now I did something, I'm describing this as I'm observing it. I'm not sure why, but maybe I can remember. Where I took the room mics onto one sub bus and the drum mics onto another. I'm not sure why I needed to do that or why I felt I needed to do that, but it just means I have to solo both. I don't have any parallel processing going on, but on the drum bus is probably a leveler doing a lot, but blended in a tiny bit. 7% is all that we're using there. Super slow time, although I'm using a Selig gain as a CV controller to take the peak detector output, invert it. No, I didn't invert it. Oh, maybe I should have. Maybe that's a mistake. And use it to drive the recovery time dynamically. So it's basically like an auto release trick. And normally I invert it, so that might actually be a mistake, but it's used so little that you don't even hear it. Welcome to the reality of mixing a lot of songs at once, where sometimes things get overlooked. That's when you learn humility, first of all, and that's also when you learn that sometimes those things don't matter, those little things. Let's break apart what I'm actually doing. There's no EQ on the console. There is on the pad through the amp, through my Vox amp. But on the drums, any EQ is going to be coming from the infusers. So like the snare top, let's see. So it's brightness, that's without it. That's with it. Brighter with the little honk in there. And that's pretty much the case. I'm not going to go into detail with every single one of them, although I'm using, again, like I did before, this sub sine wave for the toms as well as for the kick. Obviously on the kick, what I've done is created a bass part from it, and it takes the sub out of the first infuser and then sends it over to its own mix channel here. And that becomes that. You can hear it's got a fairly high amount of drive. It looks like it's 80% there. And since it's the same note all the way through, I don't even have any sometimes I'll use a matrix to create a bass line, or MIDI notes converted to CV. But on this song, it's droning along. That's been, over my musical lifetime, that's been one of the things I've loved to do, which is to find all the chords that work over one bass note. You can really hear how big the room sounds, or how small it sounds without the room on. And basically, the thing I'm going for on the drums is to let the drums hit and sustain a little bit with the leveler on the whole drum bus, and then the pre-delay reverb fills it in after that space. So you shouldn't really have a gap, and it just makes a big long sound. So that's drums and bass. Then we got all the percussion. And this is where I will go in and play, well, at least on the stuff that repeats, like the baskets and the shaker, the modern shaker and then the vintage shaker. Looks like they're about 11 bars long. It's usually an odd number that I'll choose. And I'll just do that because I want to create a hypnotic effect, but I don't want to use samples, and I don't want to loop 1 bar or 2 bars. I want to just create something a little bit more interesting over time with some breathing going on, but not completely here. And then I have the doumbek and the djembe. The doumbek's playing, but the djembe's not playing that part. Let's start it back at the top and see what happens. We'll have the flute intro. Here's somebody breathing. That's probably me. I have a loud breathing sound. It's usually all over my percussion and drum tracks if I'm not careful. There's an interesting thing in this song too, kind of a homage to Peter Gabriel. It's this guitar part. It's just muting the strings and playing that. I've got a flanger or phaser going. That's it. That's where it stops. And then it comes back in. I can hear that it's tuned to the right note, but I'm not really letting the notes ring out. And it's obviously heavily distorted. And you can tell I'm not that great of a player, but I do have rhythm. I just can't play chords. The pads are going to be coming from Peak, Novation Peak behind me. Also with a ton of reverb on it. But I also have, this is an amp of the same part. I had just gotten my reamp rig and I wanted to send something to an amp, and this was the song I was working on. And I wanted the pad to be warmed up a little bit. So it's not too heavily fuzzed out on the amp, but it's definitely more mid-range and squashed, not as hi-fi as this one. And the two together make the sound. Let's look at the flutes, because they have a good bit of processing as well. Here's the... Let's see what's going on here. Normally I keep things well organized. Now we're using a... What is this? 12 semitone shifter on that flute. Let's see what that... It's the original flute. So you can hear in the end, the octave up becomes almost the predominant sound that's used to create that intro flute. Then when we get to the main body of the song, this is the main flute. And it sounds like no harmonizer. and a pretty aggressive roll off. Well, it's not aggressive, it's high, but it's very extremely gentle. In fact, it might be, no, it's 9 dB per octave, which is one thing I really like about the coloring EQs filters, is that you have the variable slope, so you can just dial it in until it sounds right without having to choose a fixed slope. I'm doing a good bit. If we bypass this, we can probably hear. Let me play that section again, though. Kind of hard to tell with all that reverb, and then that was bypassed. Here's. Now that doesn't sound, it sounds brighter. I think I've got the tiniest bit, 1 dB of boost with 39% drive, so I'm giving it just a little sizzle. Still trying to keep it natural, but trying to add even more air on the top of that. And by rolling out that much low end, I got the balance. It's sometimes hard to remember, but cutting lows can have the same effect as boosting highs. And in some cases, it's better to do that if you have, we don't have it in this case, but if you had a very noisy track, boosting the highs would tend to promote the noise as well. Cutting the lows, it's all relative, but it doesn't seem, it's almost as bad, but it's not quite as bad that way for whatever reasons. And also you can choose which one based on the EQ you have. If you have an EQ that doesn't have a very, if you want to do a big broad, like a Pultec style boost, and your EQ can't, then sometimes it's better to do a low cut, because then everything that's not cut is included in the boost essentially. So it's just 6 of one, half dozen of another kind of situation. And as every other piece, the leveler, almost every other track rather, the leveler has a big effect on leveling out the flute without getting his breath too much. Let's talk about the reverb, since it's a huge part of the sound. The main reverb for the flutes on the whole project was the Cinematic Rooms, a great reverb from Liquid Sonics, Matt Hill in United Kingdom somewhere. I think he's in London area. And I've talked to him before because we've tried to get him to port his stuff to rack extensions, and he didn't see the value in it at the end of the day, which is neither here nor there, but we tried. David and I from Pitch Bend pitched him the idea of doing that, and it was going to be too different looking, and we didn't mind it different looking, but he wanted it to look just like this, and it couldn't. Well, this wasn't the one anyway. It was the IR. This is an algorithm reverb. It's one of my new favorite things, and we're basically just doing a version of the preset Ancient Domo, which was one of the longer, ridiculously longer sounds in there, but it's just a beautiful long reverb. And I'm also using my combinator built with Gustav's neutrons, 3 neutrons for a shimmer reverb. Now he has a shimmer verb, and I used it on a few things, but I'm just so used to this one, I got it to do what I wanted it to do. Are we even using it? I might only use it on the intro flutes. And then the fat space, somebody was just talking about fat space recently. It's my secret weapon for the short little room sound reverbs that I love on drums. It's part being a child of the 80s. Not a child literally, but my career started in the 80s, and that was the sound that you got in the 80s. So I always go to that when I'm looking to, it's kind of like comfort food for me in the audio sense. So I think that's pretty much, that covers the basic mix here. I don't know if anybody has any specific questions or anything they want to hear or have explained why I'm doing weird things with the infuser, or, oh, that's the, I'm sorry, when I said there was a flanger on the guitar thing earlier, it's actually, now where is it going to play? Gotta fast forward through it. It's actually coloring EQ. I don't know why I'm not hearing it. I want to hear it. I should be hearing it. Oh, I soloed it here. So this is a pulsar connected to the comb filter here, and filter 1 and the coloring EQ. And I'm doing a little bit of a high pass, a low pass, taking off that noise. Anyway, I love the comb filter. I'm really happy with the way that the comb filter came out and the coloring EQ. It's got all sorts of interesting applications. Let me trying to keep up with the chat here. Oh, a fan of the neutron verb. Thank you, Philip. I'm really excited by it too. It's my favorite shimmer verb. Even among the all-time shimmer verbs out there, I still like it. Maybe because I built it exactly how I wanted it to be, or I don't know. What about the automation of the coloring EQ? The automation in the sense of what's moving here is just the LFO from Pulsar. I don't know that I had any automation. Looks like I'm automating both the high cutoff, so that, yeah. So the low pass filter is riding up and down a little bit every, oh, it's not timed to the tempo. Neither of these are, they're just free flowing. So it looks like it's twice as fast, 0.12 hertz versus 0.06 hertz. And I don't know if that's the automation you were referring to in this case, but it's actually CV rather than mixer automation. And I think on the pads, I did this mid boost, and it's very subtle. Yeah, I don't even really hear it. I think I kept backing it off, and then I eventually just put the sound through the amp, and it gave me that same mid boost I was looking for to warm it up and bring it forward a little bit in that hole. You know, the flute sits pretty high in the frequency spectrum on the mix, and so you've got all this room down below it for stuff, and I was doing the super low stuff with the infuser sub, or in some songs the Mini Brute 2S behind me. So that meant that the mid-range was usually kind of empty, and the pad, I didn't want the pad to have too much full frequency bandwidth because I was keeping that for the other players. So let's move on and have a little fun here. I can't see my buttons. We're going to do a little deep dive into something I think is important for everyone to understand that I'm not sure if everybody does understand. And I set out to explain it to myself one day and realized that it was pretty simple. Despite the fact that it can be complicated, when you break it down, each of the components is simple. So I'm just going to go through the idea of signal flow and the basic types of routing that you would run into in a mixer, in a synth, in any audio device that passes signal through it. So the signal is anything we're trying to capture, generate, or manipulate. I define signal path and signal flow slightly differently, not a biggie, but for the purpose of this little presentation, signal path is all the possible paths and routing options. So you could have the compressor before the EQ or after the EQ, but not both. And the signal path for a console, for example, would include all of those possibilities. The signal flow would be the actual signal flow at the moment that you're using it and that you're trying to explain it, define it, or track it. And get some background noise on. Makes it more dramatic. Have the modular, may as well use it for something. So, and I need a drink. So the signal flow is what we normally talk about. But if somebody says, do you understand the signal flow of the console? They're probably asking, do you know all the signal paths and understand how they work? Okay. I'm just going to go on here. The simplest path is basically a straight wire, A to B. We have a source and we have a destination. That could be like a patch cord or guitar cord, or any cable would be the simple path. And it's an output to an input. And even a modulation matrix uses that with usually, some sort of modifier in between, like a scale or a level control. The next simplest thing is an on-off switch. You can have your path, and then you can insert an on-off or a mute. And an on-off and a mute are just the opposite of each other. An on button goes on when you press it. A mute button goes off when you press it. In the digital world, this is accomplished by multiplication. So if you ever worked in Reactor or other similar programs, if you want to turn something off, you send it a 0. If you want to turn it on, you send it a 1. And it's multiplication because 0 times any number is 0. So no matter what's coming in, if you multiply it by 0, the output is 0 or off. And any number times 1 is itself, which is also known as unity gain. In the analog world, an on-off switch would physically move the signal from one path to another. And so that's a big difference when you're in the digital world. You know, an analog switch would actually have two conductors, and how would it work? It would be touching the top one, and then you push the button down, and now it's aligned with the bottom one. So we don't do that with digital. We multiply it, and that brings us to the next thing. Boy, I can't really jump around because of these cute little animations. The next thing is a gain control, also known as a gain stage. We still have the same A to B, and we still have the same 0 and 1 going from off to unity. But now we have every value in between, where half of the control signal would give you 6 dB down. So it's a voltage concept rather than a decibel concept. Halfway down the knob may not be 6 dB because the knob would be scaled differently. So you wouldn't want the knob to be scaled linearly where 50% was in the middle. You want that number to be up higher because we don't hear linearly, we hear logarithmically, and it's confusing to explain, but you understand that when you create a parallel channel, it increases the gain by 6 dB. That's double the voltage in the analog world. In the digital world, it's double the signal. I substitute signal for voltage a lot, so I talk about control signals rather than control voltages because they're not technically voltages in the digital world. Okay, so that's the three basic: straight wire, an on-off switch, or a gain control. Now it gets a little crazy, but now we have another reference point because we can look at reason devices, the audio splitter merger. So the next basic type of routing you would encounter was some sort of split. There are three versions. There's a fixed version, which is like a split input A to output B and C, and that would be like a Y chord, or like a multiple jack in the patch bay of a console or a modular synth. I have like 4 or 5 multiples in that rack behind me. Then the next version would be A to B or C, where you're choosing one or the other, not both. And this would be like a speaker selector. You're wanting to send your output of your mix to the big speakers or the little speakers, but not both. And finally, A goes to B and or C would be a continuous control between them, which would be like a pan control. So it comes in mono, and then it can go either to the left channel or to the right channel, or halfway between them makes it appear as though it's in the center. An output switch, the second example, like a speaker switch, would be accomplished by splitting the signal like a Y chord and then putting two on-off switches in line with the two outputs and then wire them opposite of each other, which is actually how it's done in analog hardware, so that when the button goes down, one goes off, the other goes on, and then when the button's up, it's the other way around. So you're sending the signal to both outputs and then you're turning them on or off to get it to switch. It's not like a train track where it switches and the train goes one direction or the other. It's different in electronics. Then the next one we come across is the opposite of that. It's the sum or merge module, which you would have two inputs or more feeding a single output. And examples of a static version of that would be a summing bus or the merge input on the Spider in Reason. The binary OR switch would be like an input selector. In your car radio, you can choose terrestrial radio or a Bluetooth input or a USB input or an aux input. And like the speaker selector, it's going to only choose one at a time. And finally, the continuous example would be a crossfader, where you have an A and a B input, and you can have A or B if you go to either extreme, but in the middle you have A and B, and you can control how much of that is used. So a quick recap, because that's it. Those are the only types of routings that you'll come across, plus the last one on my list here, the many-to-many. I've covered all the others, so you can see that there's three versions: a static, a switched binary on or off, and then a continuous control version of each of them. The many-to-many I included just because I've done a one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-one, and then the next logical is many-to-many. In some cases, it could be any-to-any, like the modulation matrix. So examples of that are an audio snake that might carry 8, 16, 24 channels, just fixed. The binary would be a matrix switcher, usually in a form of a grid, where if you take the inputs from the left and the outputs along the top and you see where they meet and you punch that button, then it's connecting that one to the other one. And then a modulation matrix, which may or may not be in the shape of a matrix. The Arturia MaxiBrute and Polybrute both have this in the form of a physical matrix, but Thor and Europa and others have it in a matrix that you build yourself, but you have a choice of inputs and outputs, and then you can continuously control the amount that goes to each one. I think I have, let me get myself organized here and see. I can show you examples in Reason of all of these. They are, well, obviously the first is just anything connected to anything is the first example of a straight wire. Then we can, and I've done it here, going through the Selig gain right here in the middle. So redrum into this channel. I can mute it like we did. I can trim the level, attenuator, reduce it. And then we can do the many-to-one. And I'm not sure how I figured out how to do this. Did I might not have saved it with the whole setup. No, I didn't. I could, oh my gosh, I'm not gonna take that time to build it, but you can imagine how you can do with the Spider many-to-one and one-to-many. It's just, it gets more and more complicated the further you take it, but it's all about understanding those four basic concepts and then seeing how they are applied. Let me give you some examples in the mixer. So if we change the routing, for example, or if we just, let's just say we bypass the insert or don't bypass the insert, That is two switches happening. We have one that takes the signal. This can be compared to like the way a train would run. The train could go on the express line straight through the station, or it could be switched off the track to the local line and stop at the station. In this case, we're going through an EQ. The EQ is the station. And so we have to have a switch on the input to take it out of the main path and into the EQ path. And then we have to have another switch on the output to return it back into the main path from the output of the EQ. That is all controlled by one button, the bypass button, but there are actually two switches going on in the background, and each of those switches has two on and off stages to accomplish the switch. The sends are also, they're like a splitter with a on-off button and a attenuator, a gain and a switch. And they both split off the main signal and go somewhere else. In this case, they go to the returns of the mixer, assuming that they're patched. And then we've already talked about a pan control, how that is just essentially, it's a splitter where as you turn the knob, one channel gets louder and the other gets softer, and then you turn it the other way and it reverses, and it gives the effect, once you send it to two speakers, set up left and right, of the sound moving back and forth. But it's really just getting louder in one speaker and quieter in the other, and vice versa. I think that's the basics thing. The input gain would be a gain stage. All of the routing options, pre and post and such, would be switches again, but just getting more and more complicated because you have to be able to accommodate every possible interaction. And that is basically signal routing. And once you break it down to those fundamentals and start to recognize them as you work, it makes it easier to look at a bigger mix like the one we were looking at here and start to follow things around and realize, oh, that's just splitting off. Oh, and a parallel channel is also a Y chord, a splitter. Buses are a merger and another mute stage and another attenuation stage. We're just taking the output. In this case, the drums are fed from the output of these first 6 mics, and then the room is fed by these 3. But it's all just the same concepts: merging, splitting, muting, and adjusting volume. And at the foundation of all of them is the connection, the input being fed from an output. And Reason, luckily, you can visualize these with the cables, so some of them, the more complicated routings are still going to be difficult, but at least you can track them down by following the cable through the system. When you understand signal flow, it manifests itself as you're hearing something and you're trying to figure out why you're hearing what you're hearing, and you're trying to find where it's happening. That's when understanding the signal flow comes in very handy, because normally when you troubleshoot, you start at one end of the signal flow or the signal path, and you track it through and say, I got it here, I got it here, I don't got it here. So between that point and the point before is where the problem is. So that's signal routing deep dive. I can go off on another tangent if anybody's interested, similar to this one. But first, I'm going to check in. Philip asked about, missed the first part of the stream. Are all these live musicians you recorded or tracks from Reason devices? All live, me mostly, and Tony, the flute player, also has like a Moog setup and a grandmother DFAM. No, he doesn't have a DFAM. He has the Mother 32 and the Subharmonicon. In fact, one of our songs was started with that device powered up doing the crazy weird thing, and I'm like, we gotta make that into a song. All the rest were done a different way for me, with me laying down like 10 different drum tracks, and then adding percussion to all of those, and then having him drive up from Nashville, where he lives, and spent a week here in the forest. And that's why the album was called The Trees, because we were in the trees. And he at one point said, look, every flute I'm using so far is made of a different wood from a different tree. One of the songs is called Sunflower Rising, which is not a tree, but the flute was made from a sunflower stalk. So we kind of had to stick with the naming convention. But yeah, it's all microphoned performances, with the exception of the reamp is a microphone too. On one of the songs, which I haven't presented yet, but I may just try to go through each of these every time I do a live stream, one of them. And there's 11, so that'll get me through most of the year. On one of them, I used some factory sounds of concert tom drums, busy, like a group of drummers playing, and it was the only time I used a factory sound besides a Rhodes on one song. And then I did use a drum loop, but it was a drum loop of me playing drums that I created and made the Rex file myself and loaded it. And it just does, it's all filtered to just the really high-end stuff. It plays almost more of a percussion role, but I'll cover all that. Otherwise, everything else is all audio tracks recorded as audio, and in some cases not used. Looks like I have a whole guitar track here that didn't get used, but I didn't have the heart to delete it. The MIDI for the pad was recorded in Reason, it looks like, and then sent to Peak to play it. Half the time things were played without recording MIDI, other times they were played with MIDI. I have always done a combination of both live and MIDI, and in fact, when I got Pro Tools in the early 90s, the very first version, it was so exciting because finally I could overdub live instruments on my MIDI songs, because before that, for my early work, it was all MIDI, and I couldn't add a little shaker here or play a drum track, although when I went into the studio I did add a few things like that. Andy says, oh, thanks, is the album for sale anywhere? We're on Bandcamp, but we only have a single out right now. We are working with somebody who's a promoter who's helping us patiently release it rather than just dump it and hope for the best. So I will post a link in the, maybe I'll just do it in the Reason Talk thread. I'm a terrible promoter. I just want to make music and let somebody else deal with all that stuff. So I have to do it kicking and screaming, which I don't mind doing it, but it's not natural. It's not second nature to me. Andy says, I'm interested in your setup. There's a lot to pick up about preparation and how to have a consistently good sound. Well, ask a question. We've got the setup here. I'm in the room where everything was done, so I could show you anything in the room. I can explain it basically. First of all, since the early 80s, my day job has been recording engineer, so I've got a comfortable, I'm very comfortable in that world, and it took a long time to be able to get to where I could engineer myself. And so that struggle is real for everybody else out there doing it. Just coincidentally, not by any plan of mine, but I've done home studio projects since the 80s. My first solo record was all done on MIDI at home and then taken into the studio for 2 days to mix. To my knowledge, it was the first done that way, straight to no multi-track tape, straight MIDI sequencer, triggering the instruments, live mix down to digital too. So it was using the Sony 1630 video machines, very freaky looking, heavily modified video machine to record audio before it was common to have digital machines to record to. So I remember it was confusing. At the time, albums had 3-letter codes on them, A or D for analog and digital. So if it was tracked analog but mixed digital and mastered digital, it would say ADD. This one, we wanted to put MDD because it was MIDI multi-track and digital recorded and digital mixed, but we just put DDD because essentially MIDI is digital. It's just not digital audio. So I'm comfortable with that fact, and I think that's what I want to try to share with other people, is my experience in playing all the roles through my life without realizing it. I was doing what is commonplace now, which is sitting in your bedroom, and although I'm no longer in a bedroom, it's just trying to put all the hats on and figure out how do I become the artist, the musician, the engineer, the producer, sometimes the mastering engineer. So in terms of the setup here, it's just an evolved setup of my the drum kit is probably the most complicated part, and all the mics go into the Midas mixer, the M32R, which is kind of like the Behringer but with nicer preamps. And I'm very happy about it. I have it set up so I can EQ on the way in, and the way I figured out how to do that was also the way I've done it in the past, which was in the early days on the SSL, you could have, it was an inline mixer, so each channel had two paths, the microphone and the tape. So what I would do, working by myself, I could get the drums set, get them to they weren't clipping, which was trial and error, but after you've done a lot of other people's drumming, you kind of know where to set the preamps. Then I would come into the raw audio and play it back through the mixer and switch it onto the EQ path, set up the EQ the way I heard it, that I would have tracked with it if I was the tracking engineer. And then I switched that EQ back into the mic path and go out and record the drums now through the EQ that I set up by listening to the drums that I recorded earlier. And that way I got the EQ set the way I wanted it to on my own drums. And I did a similar thing here, recorded the drums raw. I used the SSL mixer and Reason to do my basic tracking EQ, which is minimal. Tracking EQ just means you're not trying to get it all the way there. You're trying to leave some wiggle room, but you're doing the obvious stuff like rolling off the low end on the snare drum and adding a little top end, almost always necessary. Maybe scooping out a little bit on the kick drum and similarly finding the bottom and the top on the kick drum. And you basically set it where you want it and then back it a little bit off. And if you're tracking for yourself, you may take more liberties, but if you're tracking and you're not going to be the one mixing it, then you're even more conservative because you don't know who's mixing it and what they want. So you try to keep it pretty clean, but you still have to do certain things coming into the board. Also, in those days, when you were tracking, you only had one or two good EQs besides the console, or good compressors, or, we had two LA2As and a couple of 1176s and a DBX and a few other esoteric things, and then a 48-channel SSL. So you would usually track with those outboard devices because you could only use them one at a time. It's not like a plug-in 1176 or LA2A where you can use as many as you want. You had to think more conservatively or think about your resources more conservatively. So the consistently good sound, I don't know. Preparation is very much a part of the process. I like to say that the more you do at the beginning of the process, the less you have to do at the end. So if you're moving quick and you don't have time to get good mic positions and good drum sounds, then you're probably going to have to be triggering them and sample replacing them and spending a lot of time working with, polishing turds, basically. It's the old garbage in, garbage out. So I find it feels painful at the time to have to spend that time early on to get it right. But I always like to think my later self will thank me. And speaking of wearing different hats, remember that when you're tracking, you're the tracking engineer. And when you're mixing, you're the mixing engineer. So when I'm tracking, I'm thinking of that guy who's going to mix it, which is also me. Maybe a little schizophrenic. I don't know. It works for me. I like to think of doing that guy a solid. Like, I'm going to give him good tracks so he doesn't yell at me or curse me when he's trying to mix. And it's like, wow, why didn't you get that snare sound a little bit better? Get it a little farther from that hi-hat mic or whatever it is, or it's too far from the drum, or it's too close to the drum. And a lot of that is actually spending time. I did it again. I try to do it every few years. Something where I do a deep dive on something. For example, I ended up getting microphones for the studio when I moved in here to fill out things I didn't have, and I only had 157, so I got this. I also wanted that Shure kick drum mic, so I got a kit that had 3 more 57s and the kick drum mic. So all of a sudden I have 3 brand new Shure SM57s, and so I clamped them all to the snare drum, and I put them in 3 different positions, and then I recorded that, and then I listened back, and I didn't really change what I had been doing all along, but it's just a good reality check. Oh, this is what it sounds like when you move the snare mic over the center of the drum. This is what it sounds like when you move it towards the edge a little bit more, and this is what it sounds like when it's off the rim, by an inch or 2. And it sounds very different, and always one of them is going to sound better to you than the others. And if you're still curious, then you keep that one where it is, and you take the other 2 and you do it again, but you choose other positions, maybe closer together to each other if you're trying to fine tune it, or radically different. Like, what does it sound like when I mic the side? Here's the drum head, the side of the drum, the shell. What does it sound like underneath? Which you already heard what that sounded like, et cetera, et cetera. And whenever there's downtime, I even wrote a little blog on the Reason Talk forum called "When Fishermen Can't Go to Sea, They Mend Their Nets," which is the basic philosophy of, if you can't fish, there's always something else you can do. So if you're not feeling creative today, coil up all your mic cords, or go through your sound libraries and identify sounds that you like. That way, when you're in the heat of the moment next and you've got this great idea, you'll remember, hopefully you marked it as a favorite, you'll remember, hey, that snare sound that I found yesterday, I think that would be perfect here. And that keeps you from getting sidetracked when you're in a creative flow, off looking for snare sounds. I think I wrote recently that the first time that happened to me, it was really an awakening. I started the song with this cool little chord change and wanted a little drum track to beef it up, and started looking for a snare sound. And 30 minutes later, that's no exaggeration, I found the perfect snare and could not remember why I was playing those chords and couldn't get the song to ever go anywhere else. So I adopted a different approach where I would start spewing basically ideas until I had no more ideas. Just get ideas out. And it's important, to me at least, that I didn't judge anything. It was a total non-judgment zone. Any idea was valid. Just get it out, play it out, however I have to, document it, however I have to, even if it's crudely. Luckily with MIDI, you can keep everything pretty much. And then go back and start to pick apart what you have and how it might be constructed to build a song. Somebody was recently asking on Reason Talk about how to break out of that 8-bar loop mode, where you get this great 8-bar loop going. And my and other people's comments are very similar. You develop it horizontally first, not vertically. Vertically means I get the drums, I get the bass, I get the pads, I get the melody, I get, you develop the whole thing, and then you start adding the reverbs and getting the EQ and the compression right. You're building it up. Horizontally is building it out, getting the verse, the intro, the breakdown, the bridge, the outro. You're getting all the pieces, and you're not building it vertically yet. You're just building it as basically as you can to get the ideas out and documented. And then a couple of things can happen. One is that you don't bother building up something that's not a good design. It's like building a house, starting with one of the rooms of the house and then finishing that completely, including furniture and paint, before you start to construct the next room. It's much better to plan the whole thing out, lay your foundation, start putting up your walls, then your roof, and it, you build it that way, and you're probably going to be happier with it in the end. So I see by the clock on the wall that we are right at our 1 hour time, which is my self-imposed limit. It's about all I can handle as a listener, so I assume it's about all I should be giving as a presenter. And as always, I've enjoyed it because this is what I love doing, and sharing it makes it even more fun for me. So with that, I will sign off and ask you to check back in the thread for the in Reason Talk, and I'll post a link to the album. And also, I do encourage people to ask more questions and give me more subject topics for the next time. And I'm still interested in somebody submitting a mix that they're not happy with, to let me break it down for you, and instead of doing one of my songs, and show you what I would do with it. And what sometimes just seeing another person's take on things opens up a whole new pathway that you didn't know was there. And it might not matter what I do specifically, it just might open the door for you to take it yourself to the next level. And enough babbling. I will see you next time. And as always, thank you for tuning in or watching online.